Last week marked the 10th anniversary of the terrorist attack on the Boston Marathon. We organized today's hearing to examine how the response to the Boston Marathon bombing impacted emergency preparedness and homeland security in the decade since they occurred, how law enforcement and first responders have improved their planning and response efforts, and what additional actions we may still need to take to secure community events as threats to the homeland emerge and evolve. I am honored to welcome our distinguished witnesses, Ed Davis, former commissioner of the Boston Police Department, Rich Serino, who served as FEMA Deputy Administrator and also as Chief of Boston Emergency Medical Services, and Carrie Sleeper, who served as a State Homeland Security Advisor and also as Assistant Director of the FBI. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the victims of the Boston Marathon bombing and the manhunt that followed. We must never forget the lives that were lost: Crystal Campbell, Lou Lingzi, Martin Richard, Officer Sean Collier, and Sergeant Dennis Simmons. Our heart goes out to their families, their friends, and their communities. We must also acknowledge the physical and emotional toll that this tragedy has taken on countless other individuals and families. Our thoughts remain with all of those who were affected by the cowardly attack 10 years ago, and we are deeply grateful for the dedicated efforts of our first responders and law enforcement officials who work to save lives and bring those responsible to justice. The Boston Marathon bombing was a senseless act of violence that claimed the lives of 3 civilians and 2 law enforcement officers and injured hundreds more. And it turned a worldwide sporting event and a local celebration of patriotism and pride into a scene of carnage and mayhem. It was a stark reminder of the ongoing threat of terrorism and the importance of being prepared to respond to emergencies of all kinds. The attack also highlighted the resilience and strength of the Boston and New England community and the bravery and dedication of our emergency responders and law enforcement officials. Since the Boston Marathon bombing, we have made significant strides in enhancing our emergency preparedness and counterterrorism efforts. We've improved intelligence sharing and analysis and invested in training and resources for our emergency responders. We've also invested in resources to strengthen security of what we call soft targets, from community events to NFL games, using shared best practices and funding provided through FEMA's nonprofit security grant program. We learned that critical emergency response tools like tourniquets and priority cellular service for first responders are necessary to save lives. As a New Englander, I am proud of the rapid response to the horror of the attack on that day. And last week, on the 10th anniversary of the bombing, I was proud to watch joyful crowds urging on determined race participants. However, there is still much work to do to strengthen our ability to prevent and respond to emerging threats. Today's hearing is an opportunity to reflect on the progress we've made over the past 10 years and identify areas where further improvements can be made. Our distinguished witnesses have a wealth of expertise in emergency management and law enforcement, and I look forward to hearing their insights and recommendations for enhancing our emergency preparedness and counterterrorism efforts. Thank you. And I'll now recognize Ranking Member Romney for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Hassan, for convening this panel. 2 of them, at least, are long-term friends. Commissioner Davis and I worked together when he was the superintendent of the police department in Lowell, Massachusetts, and then became commissioner in Boston. Rick Serino and I, as well, have also worked together, and he's been a real force in our community and nationally. I don't know Mr. Sleeper as well, but I presume I'll be more informed by the time this day is over. I appreciate the witnesses that are here able to describe some of the lessons we've learned from that terrible tragedy a decade ago, and to help us understand what things we can do to improve our readiness for potential acts of devastation in the future. Obviously, in the years that have passed, a lot of steps have been taken by the public sector, the private sector, as well as the federal government to make our nation more secure. But we've learned from some of the security gaps that have existed in the past, and we've made an effort to become more safe as a nation. The coordination between federal, state, and local agencies has become a high priority after 9/11, as well as after the bombing in Boston. And that's, I think, even more important following our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the ongoing turmoil that we're seeing in the Middle East. These call for continued vigilance and effort to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to protect the homeland and our citizens. I'd also know that the 2013 Boston Marathon attack coincided with the rise of social media. And I'm interested in your perspectives on the impact of social media on the security of our nation. Obviously, the number of tips that must come into law enforcement is an extraordinarily large number. Finding ones that are likely to result in death or destruction has to be looking for a needle in a haystack, and how we are able to do that is a question of great concern. So I'm going to pause with those opening comments and make sure that we have the time to hear from our witnesses. But with that, Madam Chair, thank you for your convening of this group, and hopefully we can learn lessons that are able to be passed through our federal, state, and local communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Romney. It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you all will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. Our first witness today is Mr. Rich Serino. In 2013, at the time of the Boston Marathon bombings, Mr. Serino was serving as Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer at FEMA. Prior to that, he spent 36 years with Boston Emergency Medical Services, where he rose through the ranks to become chief. Today, Mr. Serino is a distinguished visiting fellow at Harvard University's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. Welcome, Mr. Serino. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. 10 years ago, I sat testifying to the same committee to highlight the preparation that took place before the attack that saved hundreds of lives that devastating day. Today, I'm here to highlight and apply the lessons we have learned from the attack to the current emerging threats across the United States. When I think back to April 15, 2013, I see my city shining. The streets were filled with millions of residents and visitors from around the world. Patriots Day, an early Red Sox game, and the marathon comes together to create a day like no other. These are the streets where I spent 36 years working at Boston EMS, the streets where I grew up, the area I still call home today. The second thing I see when I think back to the community that came together in the face of danger in unprecedented ways, in the words of the late Boston EMS Captain Bob Sarge Haley, is everybody ran the right way. EMTs, paramedics, police officers, firefighters, and civilians all saved lives together that day. While nothing can replace those we lost as a community, we take solace that our preparedness saved lives. I often say it was no accident that Boston was prepared to respond that day. It was no accident that the right equipment was on site. It was no accident that patients were equally distributed to all the hospitals. It was no accident that lives were saved from tourniquets. Boston was strong because Boston was prepared. Some of the lessons we learned from the successes in the response have been directly applied to programs on a national level. We saw that tourniquets worked, and that started the formation of a program called Stop the Bleed that have saved countless lives. The Boston Public Health Commission Emergency Preparedness worked on family reunification and mental health support. The efforts were crucial successes supporting survivors and the family. We now apply the same level of care in the wake of terrorist events in communities across the world with an organization, One World Strong. One World Strong has helped thousands of survivors from around the world, from the Pulse nightclub shooting to the Las Vegas, to Uvalde, to Manchester, United Kingdom, to France, and more. These initiatives are formed from the tragedy by survivors helping survivors. With the leadership of Dave Fortier, and Dave is with us here today, we also saw phenomenal coordination of leadership working across agencies, with everyone working together in their respective silos, or as we call, cylinders of excellence. In the years following, many people studied the leaders of the response and the level of coordination. This exploration led to development of swarm leadership from Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, preparing hundreds of past, current, and future leaders to respond effectively as those men and women did 10 years ago. The 5 key aspects of swarm leadership principles using during the marathon response from studying the leaders were unity of mission, save lives. Number 2, the generosity of spirit in action, people able to help one another, how they're able to we saw that in the community, we saw that in the Boston One Fund. Stay in your lane, do your job, and help others succeed. What do you got? What do you need? No ego, no blame, which was nobody, no one took credit for all the successes, and conversely, no one pointed fingers when problems arose. And having that foundation of trusted relationships. I'd like to offer a special thank you to the late Mayor Tom Menino and Governor Patrick for their leadership before, during, and after. Mayor Menino and Governor Patrick set the tone long before the bombing in stressing the importance of preparing, practicing, cooperating with compassion for disasters. Both leaders demonstrated the best of servant leadership and allowed their teams to function at the highest level for the greater good. Other lessons are less easily captured in a single initiative in an organization. Today, I want to highlight the needs for these lessons to be broadly applied to ensure national security. After the bombing, we learned the value of recognizing the impact of trauma on first responders, families, and the community. Now, more than ever, EMTs, paramedics, police officers, firefighters, healthcare workers, emergency managers, public health workers are in need of that recognition and support. COVID-19 has left a devastating toll on the workforce we depend on in the aftermath of crisis. Without taking care of this workforce with adequate mental health services, strong leadership, and cross-functional collaboration, they do not feel abandoned. We are leaving the United States exposed to catastrophic future attacks being left unanswered, both in the context of lives and economic well-being, if we don't take care of our workforce. In the response to the marathon bombing, we also learned how impactful rapid, accurate, and transparent communication is for the whole of community response. Twitter was used as a crucial information to the entire city, and Ed led that whole part of the Twitter response. However, today, in the face of cyber attacks, mis- and disinformation, we are starting to lose the trust in the ability to communicate effectively. We need to remember the value of crisis communication from the Boston Marathon and institutionalize it across federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial agencies. Unlike ever before, our local emergency managers and public health workers are dealing with overlapping crisis or polycrisis. It's not just floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and wildfires anymore. It's the fentanyl epidemic, it's homelessness, it's immigration, it's terrorism, it's biosecurity, and cybersecurity threats. We need to prioritize funding in building stronger public health systems, stronger emergency management systems, and work together on the local level with support from the federal level. Local leaders need ongoing support to maintain the ability to break through the purposeful disinformation aimed at eroding trust, so that they are being able to manage everything that's being put on their plate. Lastly, the Boston Marathon response showed us the resilience of the community that stands together. Yet today, we live in a fragmented society in the wake of COVID. There's a lack of social cohesion in towns and cities across the country. How can we bring people together again? Our nation is left weaker if we do not recreate the sense of community and purpose that we felt in Boston in 2013. Emergency managers are conveners. They bring people together after a disaster. How can we lean on their skill set to help bring people together before a crisis happens to build resiliency? Let us take the lessons we learned from the Boston Marathon and use them to ensure America's health, safety, and well-being. Let us continue to honor the lives lost by preventing future disasters becoming fatal. This moment of reflection on the Boston Marathon is an opportunity to truly transform the way that we recover from COVID and prepare for the next disaster. We can do this by supporting public health, emergency management, and the EMS workforce in public safety, regaining the ability to provide trustworthy communication and find meaningful ways to bring people together again. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Serino. Next is Mr. Kerry Sleeper. In 2013, Mr. Sleeper was serving as Deputy Assistant Director at the FBI. In 2014, he was promoted to the position of Assistant Director for the Office of Partner Engagement. Mr. Sleeper was also the first Homeland Security Advisor for the state of Vermont. Mr. Sleeper has expertise in information and intelligence sharing between state, local, and federal law enforcement and private sector partners. He currently serves as Special Advisor to the Secure Community Network. Welcome, Mr. Sleeper. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Chairperson Hassan, Ranking Member Romney, other distinguished members of the committee, it is my privilege to appear before you today. My testimony regarding lessons learned 10 years since the Boston Marathon bombings will be focused on intelligence and information sharing efforts, those initiatives intended to prevent or mitigate acts of targeted violence. In the years after 9/11 and preceding the Boston Marathon bombing, the domestic intelligence architecture, or the process of how federal, state, and local law enforcement share threat information, underwent a remarkable enhancement and transformation. It was understood that state and local law enforcement played a pivotal role in protecting their communities from acts of targeted violence. It followed that the federal government needed to ensure they integrated their intelligence efforts with their state and local partners. From this understanding grew critical information sharing processes such as the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces, state and local fusion centers, and DHS's See Something, Say Something campaign, also known as suspicious activity reporting. With these processes in place, state and local fusion centers could receive sensitive or classified information from their federal partners, analyze or assess that information for context in the communities they serve, develop intelligence products to share within their community to convey the threat, and encourage suspicious activity reporting information back for further investigation or analysis efforts. In addition, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs, numbering over 200 across the nation with hundreds of state and local officers assigned, were developed to investigate both international and domestic threats of terrorism. Both the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, the City of Boston's Fusion Center, and the Boston Field Office, JTTF, played critical roles in supporting intelligence and information sharing requirements in the security planning for the Boston Marathon, as well as the investigative phase and apprehension of the perpetrators. One of the most important lessons learned in the intelligence and information sharing efforts was that Tamerlan Sarnoff was the subject of an FBI assessment prior to the bombing. The assessment alleged that he appeared to be radicalizing with potential ties to foreign terrorist organizations, although the assessment was eventually closed for lack of additional information. The information on this assessment of Sarnoff was not provided to state and local law enforcement, and the logical question was asked: if they had known, could they have disrupted the plotting? More precisely, could state and local law enforcement have pursued the allegation of Sarnoff's radicalization beyond what the FBI's Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide legally allowed? This question and the lesson learned resulted in swift change in JTTF protocols for state and local JTTF members. The FBI clarified that names of individuals who were the subject of assessments or threats were to be shared with the relevant law enforcement agencies and/or state and local JTTF members. This action, or lesson learned, impacted state and local law enforcement agencies by providing transparency into the subjects of JTTF investigations across the country. The positive lesson learned from the marathon bombing is when great leaders exemplify and drive the importance of collaboration, the public is well protected. Both Rich and Ed, seated in front of you, emulate that spirit of collaboration. Now I'd like to discuss the gaps I see in security for today's threat environment, specifically in the area of intelligence and information sharing to prevent mass casualty attacks. As devastating as the Boston bombing was to both Boston and our nation, we are in a far more complex and dynamic threat environment than we were in 2013. Individuals with little or no aspirational association to terror hate groups, citing personal grievances or affiliations to a cause, calling for death and destruction, are committing mass casualty attacks at a record pace. Whether the intent is terroristic, criminal, or due to an underlying mental health issue, the deadly results are the same to the victims in the communities where they occur, as well as our society more broadly. Public gatherings, special events, parades, schools, places of worship, grocery stores, retail businesses, funeral homes, and street corners are all recent locations of these tragedies. The causation of this rise in deadly targeted violence is complex, but it can be more successfully understood and mitigated with a more effective whole-of-government approach to intelligence and analysis of the threats and of the individuals committing these acts of violence. Unfortunately, since COVID, we have seen a significant degrading in our national collaboration between federal, state, and local law enforcement. I want to stress, this is not at the local level. I'm talking about national collaboration. In short, the system is breaking down. People and agencies are not talking to each other as effectively as they should. This deficiency has been widely observed by law enforcement leadership across the country and recently documented in the 2022 Intelligence Summit post-event report, a convening hosted by the Department of Homeland Security and the International Association of Chiefs and Police in coordination with law enforcement, intelligence, and Homeland Security partners across the nation. Since 2004, the preeminent process for federal, state, and local law enforcement to coordinate their intelligence and information sharing efforts nationally regarding emerging threats was the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council, or CICC. The CICC serves as the voice for all levels of law enforcement on the best use of criminal intelligence to keep the country safe. The CICC has successfully provided interagency law enforcement coordination on critical issues to include fusion centers, suspicious activity reporting, coordination with JTTFs, and how to manage emerging threats on a national level. The CICC, under the Global Advisory Committee, serves as a federal advisory committee and advises the U.S. Attorney General. The oversight of the CICC currently resides within the Bureau of Justice Assistance. BJA currently needs additional resources to reinvigorate the CICC for the specific intent of bringing together federal, state, and local law enforcement leadership with appropriate private sector participation to strategize on how best to meet today's complex and dynamic threat environment. Without this convening, efforts to mitigate our evolving threat environment will be left to local authorities and ad hoc efforts. I don't need to inform this body that law enforcement resources across our nation are facing critical shortages. Swatting incidents across our country are further stretching those resources in feigned calls of active shooters at schools, medical facilities, and workplaces. Given the high number of actual recent mass shooting events, authorities have no option but to respond with all available resources. Foreign and domestic terrorism, mass shooting, hate crimes, threat on social media, deep and dark web usage by offenders are all inextricably intertwined and highlight both the dynamic nature and complexity of today's threat environment. Those threats we face require the development of a national strategy that integrates every law enforcement agency into the plan and the solution. That plan requires an understanding of the threat through detailed analysis, utilizing up-to-date tools and technology to access the threat, updating training to utilize the tools and adapt to the constantly evolving nature of the threat, and the rapid sharing of threat information to prevent an attack once there is likely evidence. There needs to be a central focal point for this type of planning and collaboration, but to date, that is not occurring at the national level to the degree we require. The strengthening of the CICC would be a step forward you could take to ensure this type of collaboration required to meet today's threat is taking place. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sleeper. Our third witness is Mr. Ed Davis. In 2013, Mr. Davis was serving as the commissioner of the Boston Police Department during the Marathon bombing. He retired after more than 35 years of law enforcement experience, and he is now the president and CEO of the Edward Davis Company, a business strategy and security services firm. Welcome, Mr. Davis, and you are recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairwoman Hassan, Ranking Member Romney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I would like to thank us here, especially in the company of two former colleagues who we've been friends for many years, and I will endeavor not to repeat the things that you've heard from my two witnesses, my two co-witnesses. My firm now is at the intersection of security and technology. We work on cyber and physical security issues. So I'll try to touch on the things that we see out there that really affect things beyond the marathon. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing to examine the lessons learned in the 10 years since the Boston Marathon bombings and the many security enhancements that have been made to protect the United States. The impact of the terrorist bombing and resulting investigation at the Boston Marathon on Patriots' Day that took the lives of 3 people, Lou Lindsay, Crystal Campbell, and Martin Richard at the scene, and injured hundreds of others. And later, during the pursuit, Officers Sean Collier and Dennis Simmons were killed in this senseless attack. The attack forever changed the city of Boston. In 2013, the Boston Marathon bombing also significantly strengthened how law enforcement, the media, and the community respond to these grave incidents in the way we conduct terrorist investigations. Since 2013, the government has made significant improvements in the realm of security measures, including cybersecurity, border security, emergency response planning, and response to natural disasters. These improvements include more advanced technologies, more comprehensive planning, and increased public education and awareness, supported by many public-private relationships and innovative companies. As I discuss some of these companies and their impact on public safety, I recognize there is always more work to be done. The advancement of technology will require strong consideration of privacy rights and protections led by Congress, research, and funding priorities for technological resources impacting the landscape of policing and investigations. As a member of the Board of Advisors for AT&T and the company's FirstNet platform, I've seen the public-private partnership of FirstNet take on this challenge and improve first responders' ability to communicate on scene. The development of FirstNet was conceived by Congress following 9/11 and came to fruition in 2012 when Congress created the First Responder Network Authority. I worked with congressional leaders on this solution for decades, and I sincerely thank Congress for the vital legislation. FirstNet was on scene at the Boston Marathon this year. They provided a cell on wheels to increase the capacity for communications among first responders. They also utilized advanced technology that identified the location of all medical personnel in the area for more direct response in the case of injury. Another aspect of technology that has seen great improvement is the proliferation and AI capabilities of video and photo surveillance, both public and private. Genetec has sophisticated cameras that leverage radar and LiDAR capabilities combined with machine learning. They use AI software that can learn from normal activity and notify operators of approaching threats and of anomalies. Another company, Alchement, uses proprietary AI networks designed to detect and process traffic violations. These innovative tools allow for data-driven traffic calming tactics and allows law enforcement to shift limited resources to other priorities. Prepared allows a 911 caller to activate their camera with one touch, so dispatch can see exactly what is happening at the scene. This allows better de-escalation techniques to be implemented. 10 years later, as artificial intelligence continues to mature, these capabilities grow exponentially more helpful and more dangerous. AI can create realistic, false images of people and voice replication. These deep fakes, when used to interfere or disrupt an investigation, as we encountered during the Boss Bomb investigation, pose a distinct challenge to law enforcement that Congress could anticipate and prevent. Laws and regulations need to be formulated to safeguard the profound technology advancements as they continue to expand. Nefarious use of AI presents a clear and present danger to the safety of the American public. The private sector is utilizing these tools extensively. However, United States policing still lags woefully behind in the implementation of many of these important technologies. This is due to a lack of resources and a hesitance to implement potentially controversial techniques. Clarity on privacy concerns and acceptable police procedures needed to effectively pursue perpetrators of these terribly violent acts needs congressional-led debate, legislative authority, and funding. Technology will save lives. In closing, while these advancements have improved the environment for law enforcement and agencies to respond to crimes, the level of danger and sacrifice that police throughout our nation face cannot be underestimated. As new technology becomes available to law enforcement, it also becomes available to criminals and terrorists. New threats, both physical and cyber, are presented today. Police will continue to adapt and overcome. With that, I would like to thank all of our law enforcement and intelligence community partners for their dedication to protect our nation. And I thank you all for providing me the opportunity to reflect and share these important lessons learned since the Boston Marathon tragedy 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Thank you all three for very compelling and thought-provoking testimony. We're going to turn to our questions now, and I will start with a 7-minute round of questions and then turn it over to Senator Romney. I'm going to start with a question to you, Mr. Serino. The bombings at the Boston Marathon finish line killed 3 individuals before they made it to the hospital. Hundreds of individuals were injured, but every single person, as I understand it, who made it to a hospital survived. How did planning and preparation save lives at the marathon?
Madam Chair, the work of preparing ahead of time, that it was no accident, that practicing in drills, we call the response to the marathon the 4th of July, we call that special events as a planned disaster. We take the opportunity to train and exercise. In fact, in 2009, we had brought together leaders from around the world from bombings. We brought together the head of New Scotland Yard, the superintendent of New Scotland Yard after the 7/7 bombings. We brought together the EMS chief from Northern Ireland after the bombings there. We brought in trauma surgeons from Madrid after the bombings there, as well as folks from Pakistan and India, and brought together folks actually at the JFK Library, about 450 first responders from federal, state, local level, hospitals, EMS, police, fire, all the different agencies, and had that presentation. But the second day was probably the more important day, where we brought the leaders together, about 35 of the leaders of all those agencies and hospitals, and what do we have to change? What can we learn from others? And we learned from those folks, and we learned what they did. And then we had drills after that. We had exercises, the Urban Shield exercise. So practicing and preparing paid off.
Have the lessons that you talked about, lessons you learned from the convening exercise beforehand, have the lessons learned in planning and preparation from the marathon event itself impacted emergency preparedness policy and practices today?
It has affected across the board, from hospitals and how hospitals treat patients, from how they do everything from electronic records to treatment. It has affected how EMS and emergency management, as well as firefighters and police officers, how they respond, and what we've learned from that. In fact, had a seminar a little while later, about a year later, when the Paris attacks happened. And the people from Paris actually said they learned from what they had read about what happened in Boston, and that helped save lives there. Then they came to Boston, and we learned from them and have shared that even more broadly, again, across multiple disciplines. So a lot of lessons learned.
So that ongoing kind of convening, sharing information, reflecting, which takes time and resources to do, has been really important.
It's very important, and what's also, it's sometimes difficult, is the ability for people to learn, to take the time to learn. As I mentioned, people are very busy in all sorts, as we call polycrisis now, one after another, right, and not having the time and the resources to do that, to actually send people away. A few people came to DC last week to learn about issues that they were doing, you know, in responding to these type of incidents. But we're only able to have 2 or 3 people attend. So how do we look at expanding that so we're able to either go to them or the ability to send people to certain trainings? And then also, I think the training of leaders. We train people in tactics, and that's very important. But how do we train leaders? That's really one of the more critical aspects. And the leaders, I include the leaders of the agency, but also how do we train, dare I say, politicians, especially mayors and governors. And I know I have former governors here who understand how important that is, and you have both led during crisis. But how do we give people the opportunity to learn that as well?
Well, thank you. Good food for thought, to be sure. Mr. Sleeper, prior to the Boston Marathon attack, the FBI had information about Tamerlan Tsarnaev that the Boston Police Department did not have, and you referenced that. Some have argued that the Boston Police Department could have done more to prevent this attack if the FBI had provided the information to them. So how did the Boston Marathon attack impact information sharing between federal and state and local agencies? And are there other aspects of information sharing that you think still need improvement?
Thank you, Senator. It had a profound effect on the FBI. It had a profound effect on how federal government shares information with its state and local partners. Immediately after the concern was articulated regarding the assessment that had not been shared, protocols and processes were changed, where the FBI was ensured that information was being shared in the JTTFs with their state and local partners for public safety purposes. And in fact, now many JTTFs are run by state and local law enforcement officers for that exact purpose of ensuring that local nuance is applied to a federal investigation. It was a painful lesson learned, but the results were dramatic.
Well, thank you. A question for you, Mr. Davis. In the aftermath of the Boston Marathon attack, the FBI, Boston Police Department, and other agencies effectively collaborated to identify the bombers. Can you speak to the importance of this collaboration and how it helped to support the emergency response and investigation efforts? Are there any specific strategies or practices that you believe were particularly effective in facilitating this collaboration?
Went through in 2013. The big lesson that I learned was you cannot make a relationship during a crisis. You need to know people beforehand. In the case of this incident, the first two people I called were the FBI SAC, Rick Delorier, and Tim Albin, the colonel from the Massachusetts State Police. I did that because, as Rich said, we had practiced beforehand, so we knew what needed to be done and what resources were available to accomplish that task. And Rick had a SWAT team available. Tim had a SWAT team available. They both picked up the call, and importantly, not only did I have their cell phone numbers, but we used to meet quarterly for breakfast and discuss issues that affected us. So we were a known quantity to each other. That was true with General Rice from the National Guard. It was true with Rich Serino and the staff at EMS and the fire staff. So it was a team. And you know, I was reflecting on dating back to Governor Cellucci and Governor Romney, and we, in public safety, we've always been at the table from the highest levels of leadership in Massachusetts. That's why Governor Patrick and Mayor Menino worked so closely and so well with us, because we all knew each other. And I think that's really the solution, or the necessary preparation that every city should have in place.
Well, thank you very much for that insight, and I'll now turn to Senator Romney for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Davis, I'm interested in your perspective today as to what lessons we learned that we really haven't implemented change to address from this tragedy. You look back and say, okay, we've done a better job perhaps in coordinating with the FBI and getting information from the FBI to local law enforcement, but the response to the marathon bombing was seen as being effective by and large, but there are certainly lessons to be that were considered that we've really not fully acted upon. And I wonder if you were to say, what are the priorities? What are the things we really ought to do differently? Where have we not stepped up as far as we should have from the things we did learn? And I'm going to let each of the individuals respond to that same question. I'm putting you on the spot first, in part because of our relationship. But what are we missing? What should we be doing that we really are not doing as a result of what we learned from that tragic event?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. Kerry said exactly what I think. The FBI made enormous strides just after this incident. I testified, I met with Director Mueller, and they responded quickly, and the JTTFs acted or were more effective afterwards because of the changes that the Bureau put in place. We all have respect for each other. We work very closely together on these issues. But I see a very interesting situation developing now with an uncertainty about what police tactics are appropriate. I've just spent 2 days with police chiefs from all over the country at Harvard, and there's a continuing sort of message that we don't want to go near any sensitive technologies because of the backlash we could get from it. So there's really an uncertainty as to what's proper. And there are some jurisdictions, some in Massachusetts, that at the local level have stopped police from using things like facial recognition technology or access to camera technology. And I understand the concerns about privacy in those situations, but we must remember as a government that the police are the security team for the poor people in our cities. And it's scary to think that a political body has eliminated the use of an effective tool to solve crime at the local level when people who are the people I work with in the Fortune 500 companies can purchase the technology and use it. It's just, that's really the uncertainty of what a police department should be doing in this realm on the technology side needs a clear debate and direction. I think that's one of the biggest impediments that I see.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Sleeper?
Thank you, Senator. I'll follow very closely behind Ed's comments. Today, we are awash in threats in this country, whether they're terrorism threats, counterintelligence threats, threats on social media, deep dark web, people claiming to be belonging to some type of an ideology or a grievance they hold. The FBI's National Threat Operations Center receives about 3,000 threats a day that they have to mitigate with their state and local partners. On top of that, we have the swatting calls that every state's been experiencing across the country. Our responders are tired, they're stretched thin, we have resource concerns. So the only way for us to effectively mitigate that is to be smarter, is to use tools and technology to be able to mitigate those threats, to use intelligence and analysis as effectively as we possibly can in order to mitigate those threats. We had a remarkable focus post 9/11, federal, state, and local partners coming together across the broad public safety spectrum after Boston. Unfortunately, I'm going to say again, because of COVID, we've, I won't say ground to a halt, but many critical functions and meetings that should be taking place to stay ahead of the threat are not happening. That would be my response.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Serino?
Along the same lines is that lack of social cohesion, partly because of COVID. After from 10 years ago, after the Boston Marathon bombings, we saw people coming together. And then COVID happened, we started to see that fragmentation. We started to see the inability. You can do certain meetings on Zoom, and that's great, but there's nothing like having that cup of coffee or perhaps an adult beverage sometime with a counterpart and understanding their issues and understanding how to come together. I think that also as we start to look at the workforce, we are losing people, in all across public safety, across public health, and across emergency management and hospitals. Unless we start to really look at how we can start to change the paradigm to people look at service in this country. I had the opportunity, was at FEMA, we started something called FEMA Corps for 18 to 24-year-olds to do a year of service. Imagine doing some service in public safety, or doing service in emergency management, or public health, and taking that opportunity to give people, whether it's a gap year or when they're in college or after college, in that age group to do a year of service, to make that something that then will help us. We need teachers across the board. So how do we actually start to look at all those issues around the workforce and create something that's an opportunity for young people to actually do service to the country, because we are seeing such a need. That, unfortunately, is going to take an investment. It's going to face investment of time. It's going to take investment in money, and it's going to take investment in people. But without the people, we are not going to be able to respond to crisis, as both Ed and Kerry have mentioned, crises are coming. We see polycrisis every 15 days now. There's a major disaster in this country. Every 15 days. And it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So we have to start to address those issues now.
Thank you. I'll turn back to the chair, and because I notice we have another member that has some questions, and I'll get my chance again in just a moment.
Senator Romney, and I recognize Senator Rosen for her 7-minute round.
Well, thank you, Chair Hassan and Ranking Member Romney, for holding this hearing. It is so important that we learn the lessons and we hear from all of you what worked and what you think we need to do in the new and always expanding threat environment. And, you know, as today, as we're reflecting on the horrific Boston Marathon bombing attack that occurred just about 10 years ago, I do want to focus my questions on the effectiveness of the DHS programs to prevent the future attacks, that how we empower our local communities, the things that you've already just been speaking about so well. And so I want to talk about the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And the Nonprofit Security Grant Program provides resources to support religious institutions and nonprofit organizations that are high risk for terrorist attacks and targeted violence. We've seen this all across the country. And last year, I helped secure increased funding for the program to ensure the availability of these grants can keep up with the rapidly growing demand. And so, Mr. Sleeper, can you speak to the effectiveness of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program in protecting these eligible nonprofits from the threat of terrorism and specifically targeted violence?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. One of my responsibilities now is a senior advisor for the Secure Community Network, which is the official safety and security organization of the Jewish community of North America. We are responsible for providing physical security to thousands of locations across this country. In order to meet the threat that is being directed towards the faith-based community, the Jewish community, it is absolutely essential that there be physical safeguards in place. The essential tool for that is the grant program that you discussed, where the faith-based community can utilize those fundings for very basic things, starting with things like locks on their doors, very similar to what we think about when we're protecting schools across the country. Conduct an assessment, start with the basics, locks, bulletproof glass. It's unfortunate we have to discuss having this type of security measures, but we do. For video cameras, fencing. Another critical component of that is training, though. The training of congregants, fight, excuse me. So that's essential funding to provide security to these facilities. It's not enough funding. It probably never is, but only a small portion of those facilities applying for the funds receive them simply because
we're working to increase that this year, but I want to build on what you've just said. Do you think FEMA is providing sufficient outreach and engagement, training, and all of those things alongside with the nonprofit security grants?
FEMA has been providing outstanding support to the grant program in meeting the needs and the expectations.
That's fantastic. And I want to keep thinking about, just as the Boston Marathon, you know, you're just so proud to be the host of that every year. It's so great. You have so many other events with a global following. Well, Las Vegas, we're quickly becoming the world capital of entertainment and sports events ourselves. We got the next Super Bowl coming. We got the Formula One race coming up in November, and so many other things going on. So we understand the importance, just like you do, of securing our city for these major events, doing everything in our power to prevent from a possible terrorist attack. And so the Special Event Assessment Ratings, or SEER, they determine the level of support that DHS provides to these high-risk events, like the Boston Marathon, or like our Formula One coming up, or the Super Bowl. And I raised these issues with DHS Secretary Mayorkas last week, that the SEER assessment, the process is often flawed, with high-risk major events sometimes receiving the same rating as less complex events. So I'm going to quote, that require only limited federal support. And so as we contemplate how to prevent these future terrorist attacks, particularly at major sporting events, major events like the Boston Marathon, I think we have to have a discussion about what those specific things look like and modify the formulas. So Mr. Serino and then Mr. Sleeper, do you have some opinion about how the SEER assessment process can be improved to really incorporate as we surge up for a particular event that may not, we rise up and then have to just go back down to whatever our normal level is? And
I think as far as the severe SEER event rating, I'm not an expert on it, I'll start out with that, but I think one of the important things to realize is, as we've been talking about, is people coming together. Whether it's an official SEER event or not a SEER event, is bringing together the federal, state, local, and if appropriate, territorial, tribal organizations ahead of time, and doing that practice ahead of time and bringing them head to practice to understand long before the disaster happens, long before any sort of event happens, because the communications and how you're able to deal with something that happens small early on an event can stop it becoming much larger. And that's critical by having, whether it's a multi-agency communication center or having groups of people together in a command post all across the board. Unfortunately, that's not the case in every incident, that you have not only the public safety officials, emergency management, public health, but also the sponsor of the event to make sure you're communicating with them as well, to have all those people together.
thank you.
Senator, your Las Vegas Fusion Center Director, Carrie Underwood, is
know him
across
well. I know him well.
is across the town today at the National Network of Fusion Center Association event. He, in fact, was named the Fusion Center Director of the country at that event yesterday, so you should be very proud of.
I'm going to call him right after this. I just had a meeting with him a couple weeks ago as we're working on these.
He's articulated the concerns that he has with the SEER event rating and the necessity for additional federal support, so it's an appropriate discussion to have to FEMA, given the high-profile event that you'll be dealing with.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working on that because although Nevada doesn't have a large population, we surge up, at these times in a very concentrated area. And so those UASI formulas, the SEER formulas, they need to be reflective of the events and not necessarily the population in your city at any one point. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. I'll turn back to Senator Romney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had the occasion to help organize the Olympic Games in 2002 in Salt Lake City, and this was, of course, following only by 5 or 6 months the attack of 9/11, and so we suddenly became very focused on how we could protect the games and wondered if they would be the target of terror act. And there were 3 major categories that we focused on. One was hardening the places that they might attack, and given the fact that there were very few places to harden, relatively, why we knew what we had to do, and we hardened those things. Number 2 was our capacity to respond where there were an attack, and again, we knew the days that the attack might occur was the roughly 3 weeks of the Olympics. We knew where we'd had to be, where the EMS vehicles needed to be, and so forth. And then finally, intelligence. I must admit that which gave me the greatest confidence that our games would be safe was that the FBI put in place a very substantial intelligence capability in Utah prior to the games and was following potential threats. And so I felt relatively secure. As we now look at the circumstance of protecting our cities and our people, those 3 categories are more challenging because you're not just protecting a single site for a few days. There's so many potential sites. So hardening, for instance, all the churches, all the malls, all the grocery stores, all the sporting events, it strikes me as being almost impossible to harden every potential target. Our response capability is really quite good. We've improved our capacity to respond to an emergency. Our law enforcement is coordinating far better than we have before. But I look and believe that intelligence and threat assessment is probably the one area that's most critical to being able to protect our citizens. And I wonder how we're doing. in our intelligence gathering, in identifying threats and protecting against those threats that are identified, and what we need to be doing more in that regard. Commissioner Davis spoke about the technology that we might be able to use. Is that the great gap we have? Our foes have access to new technology that didn't exist back in 2002, frankly. And now, are we lagging in that area? But of the three categories, if you will, the hardening, the responding, or in the intelligence gathering, where's the greatest gap? Where's the vulnerability greatest? And where should we be devoting our focus and the need for the greatest improvement? And I'll start with you, Mr. Sleeper, and then turn to Mr. Serino, and finally, the Commissioner.
Thank you, Senator. It's a complex question, sir. It would take a complex response. As I said earlier, unfortunately, as a country, we're awash in threat. First, starting with the intelligence community, our intelligence community's efforts that have never been greater, but our adversaries have never been greater. Russia, Iran, North Korea, China. We were concerned about Chinese spy balloons going over our country, but yet a number of our public safety agencies use DJI UAS aerial vehicles that have the likelihood of conveying all of the sensitive information they convey back to the Chinese Communist Party. Looking at our cities, our counties, our states with advanced technology.
It makes no sense, does it?
No, sir. That's one example, but the threats we face are being addressed by the intelligence community, by our federal partners, but they're stretched. They're stretched to their limits, and as Ed indicated, technology is both a friend and a foe to us in those areas. What's particularly concerning to me from an intelligence information sharing process is there's still, and the reason I indicated why we, and when I mean the federal partners, the state and local partners, our lawmakers really need to convene and have a discussion as simple as authorities. There's debates on what authorities our federal partners have to effectively assist state and local law enforcement right now. We have to address those issues. We're in the middle of a threat environment, and we can't be trying to decide who can look at this or who can't because of what tool they have or what authorities they have. That needs to be resolved so it's perfectly clear. And then finally, is also as Ed indicated, while there's a move towards ensuring the privacy of all of us, which we want in information sharing, there's also a concern that we ensure there's a cutout, a legal and appropriate cutout for state and local law enforcement so we don't go dark with information, because the foes we're looking at now are not in a clubhouse as they were when I was doing this business and you could wire someone up and send them in, or they're on social media. That's where they're meeting. And if we don't have access to that social media, the deep and dark web, we can't protect the communities we're there to serve.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. I think on the intelligence aspect, on those three aspects, the hardening, the response, and the intel, and I think you have two experts, Kerry and Ed, on the intel. But I would also emphasize on part of the intel is looking at the public as an asset versus a liability at times, looking at how we can educate the public and how we can gain information from them to share information. And that goes back to what we mentioned earlier about trust. Generating enough trust that the public will then trust the law enforcement in public safety, public health. We've seen the deterioration of trust in emergency management. So I think that that's one key, really key aspect as part of the intelligence, as well as everything that Kerry and Ed had said. But in addition, not just the response, because the public can be an asset there too, the response. We saw that in the marathon bombing, how the public helped save lives using tourniquets, even though a lot of places weren't using them. Now we've seen thousands of lives since. And the hardening of the area is key. We cannot let each one of those stay in their own silos, in their own cylinder of excellence. We have to bring them together. But I also think we have to look at how do we do recovery and, more importantly, mitigation ahead of time to mitigate a lot of the issues, whether around security or response to disasters as well. And looking at it is we bring all that together. It cannot just be one. We have to bring them all together.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner.
To the edge, get them to the people who are in the field is extremely important. I just want to touch on that. We do target hardening every day. We go into facilities, schools, houses of worship, and government buildings, and we're surprised at how woefully inadequate some of the places are. It doesn't take much to get them up to a level that might dissuade somebody from attacking them. But it's sort of the attitude that this can't happen here that we battle, right? So Congress passed the Safety Act after 9/11. And the sports facilities that we work in have Safety Act certification. And to maintain that certification, they must have testing done. We can go in and do a plan for somebody and improve the locks and then walk away and everything goes to hell afterwards. But if there's a continual process of auditing, red teaming, checking on the improvements that were made, that's what makes the Safety Act so important and impactful to these facilities. And expanding those possibilities into houses of worship and schools, I think makes an enormous amount of sense, because those requirements will be in place and there'll be a constant review of what's happening there.
Thank you. I'm over my time. Sorry. I just had a different topic, an entirely different topic, and I can't resist with the former commissioner just raising that topic, and that is I have noted with alarm a huge increase in crime in the District of Columbia. And I don't know to what extent that's happened around the country, but I look at cities like San Francisco and Portland, and from what I read, it suggests that a degree of lawlessness has increased in those places and in other of our cities. I don't specifically know what's happened in your former city, the city of Lowell or the city of Boston, but do you have a sense of what it is that's going wrong and what we need to do to adjust ourselves in some respects? I mean, in the D.C. area, automobile theft is up dramatically, assaults are up dramatically, murders are up dramatically. I saw Jacksonville, Mississippi, and I reported in the news last night, went from 50 murders per year to now 150 murders per year. What are we doing wrong? What's the gap here? And as a former commissioner of the Boston Police Department and with a very impressive record in that responsibility, do you have some advice that you might give to us?
Every year in my career in Lowell, the crime rate went up for 20 years until we found out that community policing and problem solving could stop that. And as soon as we implemented that program, the crime rate dropped 5% every year after we did that. It went down 50%. The same thing happened in Boston. We implemented CompStat and community policing, and the crime rate went down for 7 years. It went down 5% per year. We learned how to control this. In the course of that, did we lock too many people up? Yes, we did. The prisons became packed, and there needed to be an adjustment. But the whiplash has been so severe that now no one is going into jail. They're letting people who are violent criminals reoffend over and over again, and they're not being held. And the thing that we learned in the 80s and the 90s is there's a very small percentage of people who commit a large percentage of the crimes, and if you separate those people from society, the crime rate will go down. I know there's all sorts of race and culture and enforcement debates going on, but we lost sight of that simple fact that if you continue to offend violently, you should be separated from the community.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Madam Chair, for that indulgence.
No, I thank you for the question, and I thank the Commissioner for his response and expertise. And, you know, there's been a lot of great work done to pull people who are suffering from mental illness and substance use disorder who are not violent out of incarceration, but recognizing violent reoffenders is also a really important piece of this. And so I thank you for that response. I want to turn back to lessons learned and what we need to be thinking about moving forward in terms of emergency preparedness. And this is a question to you, Commissioner, an after-action report about the response to the Boston Marathon bombing identified the challenges arising when more than 2,500 officers from multiple jurisdictions converged in Watertown, Massachusetts to apprehend Jakar Zanayev. What lessons did law enforcement learn in the aftermath of search for the Zanayev brothers about how to coordinate? How do they impact law enforcement practices today? And I can certainly remember we had law enforcement from New Hampshire headed down to Massachusetts and Watertown, and just what kind of coordination lessons did we learn?
It's a very difficult problem, Senator. For the first 10 or 15 minutes of a firefight where people are throwing bombs at you, you want everybody that you can get to come to the scene.
Right.
And so a call goes out. There are diminishing returns, though, after the first half hour. And there needs to be a way to stop that flow of people who are self-deploying. You know, if our commanders say, we need 10 officers from the state police and we need 10 officers from the Belmont Police Department, which is right next to Watertown, that can be handled. But I remember being in New York 2 weeks after the attack, and I met with a sergeant from the NYPD who was put in charge of containment of the officers who were self-deploying. They had a field set up at the United Nations, and everybody was sent to that location to be effectively deployed. We did the same thing on the day of the attack, the bombing attack. But in Watertown, because it was an unfolding incident, that did not happen. So we need to be urgently paying attention to that, assign people to contain any officers that show up there, and then also send the word out that if you're not called, you shouldn't just self-deploy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Mr. Davis, I have another question for you too, because the purpose of today's hearing is not just to take a retrospective look at the Boston Marathon attack, but to look ahead at the emerging threats to mass gatherings and soft targets. And we've talked a little bit about that today. Based on your 35 years of experience in law enforcement and your current role as president and CEO of a security service firm, what are the current and emerging threats to mass gatherings that you are seeing or most concerned about?
Well, clearly over the year, this year, over 160 incidents. The lethal combination of military weapons and of people with psychological problems creates a witch's brew that results in lethal problems. When you add to that things that happen online, we work cases every week where people are masking their identities and threatening and destroying people's reputations and utilizing social media to attack individuals for nefarious means, for nefarious reasons. We need help in those areas. So ideally, some database of people that shouldn't be being able to buy guns or buy large amounts of ammunition is sorely needed right now. And then the ability to get behind the veil set up by some of these social media companies that there's a very onerous process right now to sort of get us. You can't get the subpoena unless there's a threat of physical harm. And then you get the subpoena and you go to the FBI and they're backed up, or you go to the local police department and they're backed up, and it takes months to get the information. And in the meantime, victims are living in a state of fear and the potential of destruction of their reputations because you can't get into the person that's doing it. To say nothing of VPNs and other ways that they can disguise. So it's a huge problem right now, and we just have to pay attention to this emerging AI situation that's gonna crush us.
And I take it from your testimony, and then I'm going to turn to another issue, that local and state and federal law enforcement need more tools and more authorities to effectively combat this kind of emerging intersection of weaponry and technology.
Precisely.
Okay. I want to turn to the issue of mental health of survivors and first responders. And Mr. Serino, you touched on that. The marathon attacks impacted the mental health of survivors and first responders and law enforcement. Clearly, for those of us who have visited with some of the survivors, that was palpable early on and continues. In your view, what are some of the lessons learned from the Boston Marathon bombing when it comes to supporting the mental health of individuals and families impacted by terrorist attacks and mass violence?
Thank you for that question, Madam Chair, because the mental health aspects is something that unfortunately gets overlooked at a lot of incidents right after and long-term effects. And we've seen on the 10-year anniversary, still affecting friends of mine, still affecting some of the survivors, still affecting the families and the city. Boston has come back tremendously, but that was because it was a lot of work. Boston Public Health Commission spent 2 years working with survivors, working with the families, in getting them the help that they need. As I mentioned earlier, Dave Fortier from One World Strong has been doing amazing work in helping survivors around the world, but also helping in prevention and targeting and working with how to target, people who are perhaps being radicalized. How do you start to work with them ahead of time?
Right.
So I think the mental health aspects is what's needed not only right after an event, but also before an event. We have to look at how we can start doing some prevention and continue with the mental health aspects, not just of events of trauma, but what people see each and every day. And people are working crazy amount of hours in emergency management, EMS, police officers, firefighters. How can we take the opportunity to make sure that their mental health is there, but at the same time providing service? And again, that takes resources.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate your focus. And I will tell you that as I travel around New Hampshire, if there is a single issue that people from all walks of life and all perspectives want to talk to me about, is mental health and the need for resources for mental health. I've told this story, a number of my colleagues have heard me tell it a lot, but in the spring of 2021, when schools were beginning to open back up, it was a 10-year-old who asked me at one of my school visits what I was doing about mental health resources. And I had been kind of tiptoeing around it with the kids, and they weren't having it because they are concerned for themselves and their friends as well as their families. And it was an important reminder to me, we have so much work to do.
And I think the ability to just talk about it
Yeah.
is key. That's the start, is to have that discussion about the mental health issues for years, and guilty as charged. We, would say, so we're okay, we're too tough, we don't need to worry
Right.
about this. But I think it's important to really recognize that, and recognize it's first responders, and it's the survivors and the public as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I am appreciative to all three of you, not only for your testimony, but for your work and your experience and your willingness to share it with all of us. I'm going to give you all one last chance to say anything that you wanted to touch on that we haven't, or just to conclude before we gavel out the hearing. Why don't we start with you, Mr. Serino?
Thank you, first of all, for having us here and to remember the 10-year anniversary of the marathon and the unfortunate people who passed away and the survivors, but also what is needed to go forward. One of the things we didn't touch on is how do we look at a national, if you will, a national strategy for crisis or a national strategy for emergency management. It just came out a national strategy for cybersecurity. We have other national strategies, but we don't have a national strategy to how to respond to a crisis or a national strategy for emergency management. We have, FEMA has their, strategic plan, which is great for FEMA. And I'm not talking just FEMA, I'm talking across the board. I think Kerry touched on how do we do that earlier? How do we start to bring people together? But we need a national strategy on how to move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Sleeper.
Senator, thank you for taking the time to bring us together. I'll follow Rich's discussion. Much like we did post 9/11, after Boston and after some other national tragedies, we convene bodies together to discuss how we can be more effective. That has not occurred in the last few years. It needs to occur.
Thank you. And Commissioner.
Thank you, Senator. The problem that's facing police departments around the country, from what I've heard, is the hiring issue and the inability to get good people. So we need to have a conversation about that. But I would just like to say thank you for your leadership on this and for bringing these issues up. As Kerry and Rich said, we need to have a continuing dialogue on it. And in the past, the federal government has played an enormously important role in making our communities safer. And we're at a precipice right now where that needs to happen again. So thank you and Senator Romney for pushing this forward.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to thank all three of you for your work, for your time, and for your testimony today. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on May 11th for submissions of statements and questions for the record. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.